Greetings and welcome to this digital event hosted by the Africa Report and Jeune Afrique Media Group in partnership with British International Investment and the Climate Conversation. My name is Nicholas Norbrook. I'm the managing editor of the Africa Report, and I'm very glad that you can join us today to discuss the number one question for the continent at this critical juncture in the fight against rising temperatures. What does a successful COP27 look like for Africa? This 27th UN Climate Change Conference started on Sunday 6th and will run until Friday the 18th of November. But where will it take us? The latest report of the Energy Transitions Commission lays out the size of the problem this COP has to tackle in stark terms. A key challenge: avoiding an emerging world locking itself into fossil fuel intensive growth paths that would be catastrophic for the planet. Not so fast, says everyone on the planet who has not had the benefit of 2 centuries of cheap fossil fuels to grow their economy, and for whom, without cheap power, there will be no industrialization. So the only way this will work, ethically and financially, is if the rich world underwrites the energy infrastructure of the developing world. And that is a huge undertaking. The Commission estimates that for the developing world, not including China, we will need to mobilize $1 trillion a year, with everyone from development banks to states to institutions to the private sector having to come on board. Currently, the rich world is trying and not succeeding to mobilize $100 billion a year. We need 10 times that. And that doesn't even scratch the surface of what we need for adapting to rising waters and prolonged droughts on the continent, which is not some climate future. In many parts of Africa, this is a climate reality today. So getting this quantum of cash is the hard problem we will be addressing in our first panel. And I'd like to introduce our panelists: Lilian Macharia, Director, Division of Portfolio Management for the Green Climate Fund, and Olajubi Makinwa, Chief Intergovernmental Relations and Africa at the UN Global Compact. A very warm welcome to you both. And for our viewers who have just joined, let me explain our running order for today. Our opening panel, Money versus the Hard Problems, is first up. Our second panel will be with Chris Chijutomi, Managing Director and Head of Infrastructure Equity for BII, and Linda Mabena Olagunju, the CEO of DLO, South Africa's largest network of clean energy. And we'll be looking at the most promising areas of innovation there. So stay tuned for that, our second panel coming later up. But before we dive into the debate, a message from a man who is busy fighting Africa's corner at this COP27, Mahmoud Mohieldin, who we spoke to earlier. Welcome, Mahmoud Mohieldin, UN climate change high-level champion for Egypt. I know you have a terrifically busy schedule at the moment, so thank you for joining us. And I wanted to dive straight in with what is the heart of this digital event today, really to ask, what does a successful COP27 look like for Africa?
Right. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share some expectations of the outcomes of COP27. And it's good that we focus on Africa. This is one of the main aspects of the potential success, to give some adequate attention to Africa and African priorities on the climate action agenda. It is being confirmed that Africa is only responsible for a limited contribution to the emissions. Figures are around 3%, but it has been proven that Africa has been disproportionately impacted by the deterioration of climate change. When it comes to access to electricity and energy, 600 million in Africa out of a global total of 800 million do not have access to electricity. We have tens of millions of households around the African continent without access to clean cooking, with variety of health and life hazards, in addition to bad contribution to emissions as well. So as much as we can be doing better in areas related to mitigation by investing more in renewable energy and investing more in decarbonization, that would be great for the African countries. And we hope that such projects will be highlighted. And I'm happy to see a good engagement by the line ministries in sharing priority projects for their countries during an exercise that we did as climate champions with the presidency of the COP and the UN Regional Economic Commissions.
So can you give us some examples of successful mitigation and adaptation projects in Africa, crucially that can be scaled?
I would say in 4 areas in particular. In solar projects, I got proposals to enhance solar capacities in a number of countries, including from Senegal, from Egypt. Some of these projects came as well in a kind of a nexus approach, linking energy to water management and agriculture. We have some projects in decarbonization, including in hard-to-abate sectors, in cement, steel, and other activities. Shipment as well is being highlighted. We have received proposals for solar rooftops, not with the big scale like the projects in Ouarzazate in Morocco or Benban in Egypt, but they are very much important, especially for remote villages, and very affordable technologies that are going to be applied there with good contribution to the supply chain on that. On adaptation, it's primarily public financed projects. Some of the latest reports on the climate action agenda is reminding us that the role of the private sector is as limited as contributing to around only 2% of the global finance for adaptation. Africa is not very different. There's no more than 3% contribution by the private sector.
That is an incredibly difficult statistic. I mean, what you're saying is essentially that because adaptation finance doesn't deliver short-term results like a solar park, it's just attracting almost no money at all. I mean, it perhaps took a COVID-19 pandemic for us to understand the benefits of public health investment. Are we going to need an environmental COVID-19 disaster before we really understand the benefits of investing in adaptation investment in particular?
I hope not, and I hope that we'll be wiser this time by spending more on the prevention rather than the cure. COVID-19 was a reminder of failures in preparation and prevention, and we paid globally a heavy price for that. Adaptation would require different project design, different public-private partnership, and we need as well to internalize and factor in the negative spillovers from variety of economic activities for these projects to be feasible and with commercial gains. We need definitely to see serious work in the overall frameworks and regulatory frameworks included. And we need actually to identify with some sort of micro details what could be more feasible than others when it comes to private sector investments in adaptation. And we started to see areas like investing in mangrove plantation, like investments in partnership with institutions in areas related to infrastructure resilience, especially in the coastal areas. So there are some signals of possibilities to get the private sector more involved, but without really forcing it, because if we force it, that will be really a recipe for disaster. So we need really to realize why the private sector is now eager to engage more in decarbonization and renewable energy. We mentioned solar. I would like to mention wind as well, which is a new growing sector. And it's great that many African countries are at the top of the wind atlas and green hydrogen as well.
So this is about projects then. I mean, it can feel like there are two competing narratives out there. One around this idea that the rich world has made lots of promises, but not really delivered any cash for African adaptation projects. And another view which says the cash is there, but Africa lacks well-designed projects for that money to flow into, a little bit like the phenomenon we see in infrastructure project finance across the continent, where there is the cash, but there aren't really the projects. So which narrative is correct? Rich countries have overpromised and underdelivered, or that Africa's really got to sort out its adaptation projects?
I think the two narratives complement each other's and help us in solving that jigsaw puzzle. The 100 billion had been proposed, as we all know, back in 2009. And it is not fair to say that all advanced economies didn't deliver, because some of them did, but the minority, 6 to 7 countries out of 23 countries managed to deliver their fair share and fulfilled their promises of the 100 billion. Some of them even exceeded 100% of fulfillment. France, Germany, a couple of Nordic countries, Holland, Japan have been on this short list of those who have been delivering. But at the same time, the rest of the advanced economies didn't. But again, if all contributed, the 100 billion that may sound like an interesting round figure back in 2009, with what we know more based on evidence coming from IRENA, from IEA in Paris, the International Energy Agency, from other estimates, independent estimates of the cost per country, aggregating them, the 100 billion is just a drop, I wouldn't say in an ocean, but a drop in, say, in a large pool of funds that requires really more funding than that. The 100 billion is still essential because it can help in leveraging, it can help in de-risking, and it can help in supporting MDBs. But then the other side of the story, this is the supply of finance. The demand of finance need to be supported by pipeline of projects. And I think we did well jointly with the UN and the presidency of the COP27, to provide illustrative examples of projects. If you are keen really to see projects, yes, in efforts that we did during the last 3 months, we have more than 400 submissions from the 5 region economic commissions, including the African Regional Economic Commission. And the variety of projects goes across sectors, across countries, and across sizes, from the small to the large to the mega projects. So there are projects, and we're going to be sharing them in a compendium at the COP. And there is going to be at least 3 to 4 events in the green zone, blue zone, and in the pavilions to showcase these projects.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud Mohyeldin, and best of luck as you wrangle the delegates and find the convincing arguments to push things forwards.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again to Dr. Mahmoud Mohyeldin. Lillian Olajobi, you are currently at the event in Sharm el-Sheikh, and you heard Dr. Mahmoud, talking about a drop in a very large pool. I just wanted to get your thoughts, first of all, on what a win would look like, really, for the continent at this COP. Maybe, Lillian, you could go first.
Thanks a lot, Nicholas. And first and foremost, also just to thank you also for having me on this session. It's an honor. And in response to your question, and to speak more, to pick up on what Dr. Mahmoud said, first, it's to taking it from the background and the context. We know we are not on track to get to the 1.5 degrees centigrade target. We also know that we are woefully behind the $100 billion ambition that has been set in terms of annual contributions. So the first thing, and there has been a lot of commitments made previously, and a lot more, so to speak, disenchantment with the delivery against those commitments. And I think, again, we'll be at another COP where potentially there's going to be a push to get additional commitments or get some further commitments or some form of, agreement of sorts. What to me would be really, really important is to first and foremost recognize that we are we're working against a narrowing window of opportunity for action. We've both witnessed the increasing frequency of climate, disasters that are affecting both the developing and developed countries. So nobody needs to be told about the reality of climate change and the severity and the cost that it is wreaking on both developed and developing countries. However, we also know developing countries, including Africa, do not have the capacity to respond as effectively or even, appropriately, because they don't have the means. So that cost is only going to get worse if we don't take the appropriate actions. To me, a successful COP would be one where we do away with the talk and really now walk the talk, right? And that means we elevate the ambition. We need to step up and make up for the financing gap that has been existing. And we need to operationalize the commitments that have been made to date. So if we can get that, that would be one thing. The second thing is that means that beyond the financing is the actual commitment towards making sure on the developing and developed countries, especially is making sure that we are transitioning to low emission development pathways, because we not only have to adapt, we also have to reduce the emissions. Otherwise, the hazards continue to escalate. So we have to at least have that commitment. But as I also say, we do have to have the means to do that. So the actual flows have to actually happen. And I would say from the GCF, I think I would say we have, contrary to the narrative that there may not be enough capacity, for GCF, we've been able to, between the previous replenishment and the current replenishment, we've been able to double the amount of programming that we were able to do. And to me, that's demonstrative of the absorptive capacity of developing countries. And if that's even doubled, I think that tells us that actually countries can actually absorb the financing. So that's not the issue. The issue is that needs to be availed, and with urgency, given the fact that we don't have a lot of time. So absolutely, that's I think what needs to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. Olajobi, if you had to sort of have 3 ambitious goals that Africa had to manage to get from this conference, what would they be?
Thank you, Nicholas, for inviting me. And I also want to thank my co-panelist, Lillian. She has already set the stage in terms of the enormity of the challenges that we're facing today with regard to climate action. And the UN Secretary General also told us that we are getting dangerously close to the point of no return. And we also know that we do have the challenges are there, but there are solutions that they are already available. Many of the solutions are available. So what for me then should we get from, should Africa actually get from COP27? Lillian has mentioned it, and I will say it again also, that promises have to be delivered. We hear the words accountability, action, implementation. They must not be mere words again. They must be backed by action. And so COP27 needs to deliver on the action agenda for mitigation, for adaptation, for finance, and means of implementation. So there must be demonstrable progress in each and all areas. Financing has to be new, additional, predictable, and reliable. For example, the Glasgow commitments, they have to be fulfilled in full, on time, and without any preconditions. COP27 needs to realize its ambition of implementing previously agreed commitments, like I said, notably in climate financing. We also welcome the new pledges that are being made. You know, even at COP27 here now, we've had new pledges. But most of these pledges, Dr. Mohedin said, a number of the pledges, you know, the one made in 2009, only 6 or 7 countries, developed countries, have fulfilled their pledges. So we've had so many pledges before, so many commitments that are made, but they are broken. It is time. The time is now for us to make sure that we deliver for Africa. Also, let me say here that even for COP27, the private sector has to speak on the table. They have to be. They have the power. They have the financing. They have the ingenuity. They have the technology. They have to be. They must not be on the menu, as people say. They have to be part and parcel of the discussion here at COP27.
Absolutely. I mean, we'll come to the role of the private sector in a moment, but just to stay with governments from around the world, and you know, I don't want to play back the greatest hits, but we had the 2008-9 financial crash. We had fierce nationalism, shall we call it, stoked by the austerity that followed that period. Then we layered COVID on top of that, and now a war in Ukraine. These are short-term concerns that are very pressing. Lillian, are you sometimes concerned that even if the moment is now, the attention or the bandwidth for governments to actually take these long-term decisions is going to be very short?
Absolutely. I think that's a definite concern and a legitimate one, because I think governments think more on a political landscape. Governments are elected to office by their domestic constituencies, and they tend to play to the domestic constituencies, not to the global constituencies. But I think the other bit is we need to remind governments that they're also global citizens, and we're facing a global crisis. What COVID taught us is that never mind what country we belong to, we are also affected by global, challenges. It doesn't stop at the borders just because we belong to one country. And I think that's something that countries also need to remember. And I think this is one of the things that we are hoping that our politicians will think about. Yes, there may have to be some trade-offs to look at both the short and long-term aspects and look at how to pragmatically balance the immediate and short-term realities with long-term. But we don't think those are mutually exclusive. They have never been mutually exclusive. I think also what you also realize, if you look at what also happened during COVID, there's also an increasing social awareness and consciousness that also came out of it. So I think there's also a lot to build upon from that period as well. So I don't think it's an either or. It's a matter of whether we can build on that and build in a positive way, in a manner that is not irresponsible, but also a manner that also makes sure that we don't neglect the realities that are actually facing us. Because after the present short-term pressures, we are still going to face the futures, and we can make those commitments and decisions now, and we need to, because the future will be staring us in the face, and we will have to account for that, and the price will be a lot more dire than if we did it now.
Olajobi, does that ring true to you? As we're talking about it, it does seem to be that one of the key points will be to try and connect the sort of global rich countries with African adaptation priorities in a very forceful way. And perhaps it might be distasteful, but given the, the fierce nationalisms I mentioned earlier, given the, for example, the fortress Europe mentality we've seen in politics in Europe at the moment, couldn't African negotiators actually lean into that and say, you may stop a handful of rubber dinghies, but if you do nothing over the next decade, then it's not a few rubber dinghies that you have to be concerned about. It's tens of millions of climate migrants. And that's the report of a few years ago when projections were much more mild. Is it time to rattle the cage a little bit?
Yes, and COVID-19, as I've said, has how interconnected we all are, and how we were able to get the vaccine out quickly. But I must say also that when we got the vaccines out, developing countries, and even after when others were getting their vaccines, many of our countries didn't even have vaccines.
Yeah.
Actually, now, the solution had to come from the continent itself. And I just want to, we are all interconnected. And SG, the UN Secretary General, said that it's a choice for us. We either cooperate or we perish. So it's not that one area will lead the others, will, avoid climate change. No, we can see, so many, flooding in Africa, the temperatures in the donuts. I just came from New York, during the weekend, and it was as if we were in summer, the weather. So we either live together or we perish together. Humanity, as say exactly what the NG said, has to cooperate. We have a choice. We either cooperate or we perish together. And I believe that we shouldn't perish together. The solutions are there, the resources are there. It's only the allocation. And the fact that developing countries, especially Africa, do not have the capacity, as Lillian said, the funding, do not have. So we need to work together. We need to cooperate together. That's what SDG 17 talks about. It's your partnerships. It has to be partnerships. Yeah, thank you.
We sometimes, and this is a question for both of you, but I'll start with you, Lillian. We sometimes pigeonhole climate mitigation and climate adaptation and label mitigation as something that the private sector can do because you can make money doing green energy, while adaptation, building a sea defense wall or creating irrigation systems that work, that's something very much harder to make short-term money from, and so better suited to state or institutional finance. That seems to me probably too simplistic. Is there other ways of making money from doing adaptation? And how do we get private sector money into adaptation?
Well, yeah, for sure. I don't think we live in a dichotomy of mitigation and adaptation. That's not real life. For sure, definitely there's certain things that tend to fall more into mitigation or more into adaptation, but I don't think projects are necessarily struck into either mitigation or adaptation 100%. And that doesn't mean that a mitigation project does not have adaptation benefits. So technically, then it doesn't mean that a private sector can only work in a project that only has mitigation benefits. And also, I would say that adaptation projects also can attract private sector. The only thing is, again, remember, adaptation is also wide. It's not one sector or the other. It's just that it depends on potentially what you're looking at, because also you can look at power and energy as mitigative, but also when you're looking at it, for example, in terms of supporting healthcare, that's maybe an adaptation aspect, or an irrigation. That's not just a matter of mitigation, but it's also helping farmers adapt. So again, it's not 100% pure, and therefore in such instances, you will find that you can have a private sector participating in some of those adaptation projects or cross-cutting projects for that matter. And we're also seeing, actually, in certain instances, private sector participating in actual pure adaptation areas. For instance, the GCF has been working with Acumen in some of accelerators where they are investing in climate smart agriculture and they're making returns on that. So it's really also trying to push a bit the envelope on areas that are perceived to be high risk. Not that they're high risk, it's just that the knowledge gap or information gap exists. It doesn't mean that they're not viable. In infrastructure, we're working to sort of develop methodologies to address and look at risk, to de-risk infrastructure in terms of climate proofing and figuring out where do you plug in public finance, where do you put in policy risk, de-risking measures, and therefore make it more attractive and viable for private sector participation. So that's an adaptation, infrastructure, investment, but that, again, it's not a pure cut. It's just that it's probably not as developed as the mitigation kind of projects. But there's a lot of work already ongoing there. I was talking to a colleague about even some thoughts, some things we were discussing with some of our partners about even coming up with an adaptation market, almost like carbon markets, where you're now getting private sector to be paid on delivery of certain adaptation benefits. The only thing is we have to develop adaptation standards, for instance. So there's a lot of scope where you can get private sector to deliver maybe certain services or goods at a certain price that's affordable and get them paid. But you get them into certain services in an affordable way, but they're delivering certain benefits. Otherwise, that with their own resources that then relieve and free up resources for public resources for other investments.
Sure. Olajobi, you have at the Global Compact the job of federating private sector leaders around this issue. What are you hearing from them in terms of where they think they can be of use, and where are you trying to push them to go a bit further than their comfort zone, shall we call it?
Yeah, thank you. Let me actually start by saying that the Edelman Trust Barometer Survey for 2022 finds that more people around the world would like business to play a bigger role on societal issues such as climate change, economic inequality, workforce reskilling, and racial justice. So the fact is that more people in the world today trust the private sector much more than even their government. And that's a big role for the private sector. So it suggests that businesses should embrace the responsibility of becoming stronger pillars of climate adaptation and sustainability all over the world, and more in particular in Africa. For this to happen, therefore, I believe the following conditions should be met. Number one, Africa's private sector, like I said before, must be seated at the table. They should play a leadership role in setting and advancing Africa's climate adaptation agenda, and to leverage, its privileged access to technologies, to skills, and financial resources. They have to leverage that. The Global Compact, we have a new initiative called the Africa Business Leaders Coalition. It leverages a singular Pan-African private sector voice to, among other things, to call on the international community to fulfill and enhance the $100 billion goal by 2023 at the latest, and ensure that at least 50% is 50% is invested in adaptation and resilience. So our Africa Business Leaders Coalition have a statement that we are launching this evening, will be releasing this evening, where almost 60 companies have signed it, saying that they have made some commitment themselves to taking climate action. And they've gone further also to call on the international community to also fulfill their promises. I will also say here before, I want to say also that our African governments also, they have a role to play in this by ensuring that they create an environment for business to thrive, so that at least they can also get involved in the issues of taking climate action, whether it's in mitigation, adaptation, in whatever form.
Sure. Well, this has been the discussion about the difficult job of raising the cash. But let's assume for the moment we've got the cash. Where should it be spent? You know, if we just had news in just now of an anonymous billionaire who wanted to give $100 million for a specific adaptation project on the continent, Lillian, where should it go? I've just given you $100 million. Doesn't happen every day.
100 million for the African continent?
For a single country.
Okay. A single country is a bit difficult to say. Because I was going to say, well, I would try and leverage on ongoing projects, for instance. Let me say, for example, the Green Climate Fund has invested, for instance, in the Great Green Wall initiative. It's already invested like 1.1 billion. It's that in 30 projects. We could add on to that and then expand that to additional countries. And what that would do is leverage on other investments we've already made in those other countries, and it's in different sectors. Again, remember what we talked about adaptation. It's not, again, it's not, I think when you're looking at adaptation, we should not just be looking at it as it's a standalone. It's cross-cutting. It has also aspects of mitigation linked to it. And it's also not just one single sector. So, for instance, you may talk about whether it's agriculture. Agriculture has linkages with water, has sometimes linkages with energy. So it needs to leverage on all of the other investments so that it makes a lot more impact. And that's the idea behind that. So I would probably leverage on, for example, such an initiative, which is already tapping into a lot more resources. So if you have that and you have from that you're able to get maybe about 10 times that kind of investment, I think that would be what I would look at.
So if you had to go back to the billionaire and say, listen, 100 million is not going to cut it, but I have this project, the Great Green Wall. It fixes problems of desertification. It fixes problems of young men who have no livelihood because of the creeping, encroaching desert, and so they can get caught up in militancy. It cures, even takes carbon out of the atmosphere if we manage to green bits of the Sahel. But I'm going to need this much. How much would a project like that seriously require?
I mean, the sky would be the limit. Maybe because again, it also depends on how far you want to go with it, and how much do you want to expand it to? Because, for instance, if you're looking at serious, let's talk about green transition. You have something like the South African power pool, West African power pool, and you're trying to get the countries linked to that to just tap into that for energy. You've already talked about first getting the countries linked to that to get into the green energy part of it. And that would also support a lot of other, I would say, adaptation exercises around that, right? Then the next part would be then looking at if you're trying to climate proof some of the infrastructure, because part of the challenge we have right now is also the fact that if you don't climate proof the infrastructure that exists, and with the increasing events, what's happening is that all that investment just gets wiped off in a flood, right? And then it just means it looks like we're never making any progress because all the investment we make gets, destroyed, and then we are back to square one, and then we're not getting hardly enough resources, and all countries are constrained. So to make progress, let's climate proof. Let's build on on some of those key critical infrastructure. And then the other bit is early warning systems, right? We are not waiting to react. We want to be able to predict so that we plan. We are able to identify the most exposed. We have knowledge in terms of our planning, and that helps us be a bit more proactive and less responsive, and we mitigate loss and damage. It's cheaper for everybody.
Thank you. Well, Ajobi, I mean, we just heard the phrase "just transition." There seems to be in certain parts of Africa's private sector, related to the energy sector, some real disquiet that after they finally managed to emerge, and I'm thinking of, for example, independent oil companies in Nigeria who managed to buy up assets from Shell or from other international oil companies, and in the last decade have been starting to get onto that energy value chain and start deriving real value in Nigeria, for example. There is some disquiet that they should suddenly have to close down all of that. So what does a just transition mean to Africa's private sector when it comes to the old-fashioned energy sector?
Yes, Nicola, I think the issue of climate action itself has to be looked at from the development lens. So a just transition for the continent, therefore, must be mindful of the special circumstances of Africa and in each country, where energy demand is growing rapidly to meet the developmental needs, but where energy poverty remains prevalent on the continent. So it's imperative to ensure universal, affordable, and low-carbon energy access across the continent, while protecting vulnerable communities and accelerating inclusive economic growth through ensuring that no one is left behind. So, of course, big African companies that are currently, not my emphasis on currently, here, that are involved in the fossil fuel economy should not be expected to simply stop operating. They should be encouraged to take a longer-term view by evolving their business model towards lower carbon fuel and eventually to the net zero action economy. Of course, it's not that they should not start; they have to, But we need to ensure that the issue of we look at it from the development lens. We cannot avoid that. It's important.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both for a fascinating discussion. We've only scratched the surface, but I know that you'll be both advocating Africa's Corner in Sharm el-Sheikh, and we thank you for it. Thanks again for your participation on this discussion. We'll now have a short film from the Africa Climate Conversation, which brings together the latest thinking and research and advocacy on how climate change affects Africa. And after that, we'll be back with our second panel. So stay tuned, and thanks again, Lillian and Olajobi.
Thank you.
We have 1.8 billion youth in this planet, and majority of that are from Africa. The cascading impact of climate change is obvious as droughts and floods are crossing the borders of regions and countries. Right now, leaders need to step up. They need to prioritize youth innovations in climate change adaptation planning. They need to prioritize youth inclusion in decision making. In fact, we need to include young people in the executive boards of organizations so we can always have different perspectives and consider the diversity of young people. We have so many young people and youth groups that are championing climate change adaptation. I can speak of Green Africa Youth Organization, I can speak of the Youth Climate Council, I can speak of so many across Africa that are championing climate change adaptation. They are helping vulnerable communities to withstand climate impact, and some of them are actually equipping women groups with entrepreneurship skills that are directly responding to climate change and the impact of climate change. This is where we need to prioritize, and this is what we need to start doing.
Welcome back, and welcome to our second panel from this digital event, asking what a successful COP27 looks like for Africa. I'd like to welcome Chris Chijwitomi, the Managing Director and Head of Infrastructure Equity for Africa and Pakistan for British International Investment, and Linda Mabena Olagunju, the CEO of DLO Energy, South Africa's largest network of clean power. Now, getting innovative in our financing is going to be critical to success if we're going to marshal the funds needed, as we were speaking about in the previous conversation, but we'll also need to be innovative in that infrastructure itself on the continent, infrastructure that fits the new demands. Linda, let me start with you and with the news from Monday about the $8.5 billion deal to help South Africa decarbonize its economy that was backed by the UK, the US, and the EU. Your own company, DLO Energy Resources, must be, I imagine, one of the leading beneficiaries of this deal, no?
Thanks for the question. No, we would first have to see how those funds are allocated. Most of those funds are actually going towards retiring Eskom's coal plants. So one of the coal plants, which is Gomatyu, was decommissioned last month, and they were able to retain jobs in that coal plant in terms of transitioning it to a renewable energy plant. So the funds aren't. It's not clear whether private sector companies like myself are going to benefit from those. I think they're more focused towards the state utility as well as building the transmission network in South Africa.
It is, though, I imagine, a good piece of news that the country will be investing more heavily in clean energy.
Yes, and it's mixed. I think for me, the honest truth is, firstly, it's not enough money. I think President Ramaphosa went on record saying that we need about $90 billion. The number keeps shifting. Last week it was we needed $4.6 billion. And for me, it shows that there isn't enough detail around how that funding is going to be spent widely. And I'll unpack what I'm saying in a bit. So whilst I spoke about the decommissioning of the Gomatyu power station and that jobs were retained, no one is speaking about the fact that the coal sector has additional value chains that it adds to the power plant itself. So we're talking about the employees of the power plant, but we're not necessarily talking about the jobs created through the extraction of coal. So for example, the mine workers, the transporters of the coal, the small businesses that are generated around an industry, which currently contributes 5% to South Africa's GDP. So it's not that we are not for clean energy. Obviously, we're a clean energy company, but I think that a lot more strategy has to be put in place for how we're going to replace those jobs and the value chains created. And where I am a bit concerned is that I've not seen the support for local manufacturing to the extent that I would have liked to see, because that's how we're going to drive more jobs and find a way to replace the jobs lost if we actually start manufacturing these goods ourselves.
That was part of the thinking behind US President Biden's Green New Deal. He said, we will never, as a Democratic Party, get the US weaned off fossil fuels if we don't also make the case for the green jobs that will be generated by doing so. Do you think that's the piece which is also lacking in the South Africa example?
Most definitely. I mean, due to the start and stop approach they adopted with our renewable energy program, a lot of manufacturing plants closed in South Africa. So we saw a lot of factories shut down and still leaving the country, right? And even for the existing manufacturers, so in addition to being project developers, we acquired a manufacturing company which manufactures protection schemes for substations. And as a living example of, it's the country's only Black female-owned plant. And I can tell you we've waited over 2 years for funding, and it's been a long and arduous journey to get here, So what I'm trying to say, there isn't enough support for local entrepreneurs who are actually building, the materials that are required for this entire electricity value chain and actually employing people. Because the only way you're going to start to address the jobs crisis that is looming on the continent at large is you need to find a way to get people involved in the sector. Additional to that is people aren't adequately skilled for these roles in the sector. So I'm interested to see how one takes a coal transporter and puts them and plugs them in to a renewable energy plant, which we all know post-construction, the jobs decrease, right? Because it's a high technology plant. So you're not going to have thousands of jobs on one plant. It's during construction, but no one talks about what happens during operation of those plants. And the only thing then I see that's going to sustain that is if we're making things, building things ourselves to plug that jobs gap.
Thanks, and we'll come back to the financing roadblocks in a moment. But Chris, welcome. I imagine at BII you are happy about this deal with South Africa. And I was wondering to what extent it's generous, whether it's quite South Africa specific, given the very high intensity of coal in its power generation.
Thanks, Nicholas, and thanks for the Africa Report for inviting me onto this panel. And I think, Linda has touched on quite a lot of interesting facets to this. I guess one is around the quantum of the capital. So I think any capital is good, but capital is also not enough for the challenge that the continent is facing. But I guess from a practitioner's point of view, you've got to start somewhere. So I think from where I'm sat, and I guess from a BII perspective, it's good news that the Just Energy Transition Plan for South Africa is getting more traction, including the announcements about the capital at play. Because I do think as much as we can plan and put a lot of structures in place, we also need to actually get things done. Because, there's a big climate urgency here. The planet is suffering. We're seeing people in the continent being impacted on a daily basis. So there's an element of we need to move forward and get things done, but at the same time, reflect on some of the points that Linda touched on, which is around how can you also create a sustainable ecosystem that helps to address some of the challenges that will occur, say, from the coal perspective. As you shut or plan to shut coal plants off to bring more cleaner energy on board, what about the ecosystem that can also be created from manufacturing of panels to manufacturing of cable to probably highly skilled work that will also be required to maintain the ecosystem there? So from a BII perspective, we are involved in the South Africa JET, as it's called, Just Energy Transition Plan, alongside a number of other development finance institutions. I think the idea here is let's look and see how we can work with the South African government to come up with a credible plan around how do you, in the first instance, decommission some of these plants? How do you actually reposition some of them? Because there's an element of the word just transition. So it's not probably an immediate transition to renewable, but it's about a transition in terms of, do you go from coal, do you go to gas, do you then go to renewables, and then you go to hydrogen? So I think it's really going through in a bit more detail around the structures that's required to actually get us to a kind of a mitigation position of the net zero plan for South Africa. And I think the potential template being created with the JETP program in South Africa is definitely something that other countries that are higher emitting in the continent and also in other developed, I guess, frontier markets can also replicate. But let's start with South Africa first, with the capital that's available. Let's pick some impactful projects, of which some have been identified. Get the relevant capital providers, the relevant developers, the relevant government agencies together, and then put in place a plan that would lead to some real action in terms of some tangible projects coming out of it that we can then learn from, replicate, or optimize to then take it to the next level. So for me, I think, in sum, I think it's good news that this is now progressing forward with a defined capital commitment. I think it's not going to solve everything immediately, but the idea is really starting from somewhere because the climate emergency is real. So we do need to start somewhere. And I think South Africa seems a very well-placed country to actually start that process from an African perspective.
And it does point towards an understanding in rich countries around the world that they are going to need to pay something, ideally a lot, for the energy infrastructure of the emerging world to be a clean one, essentially. And without wanting to flip on the full beam optimism, Chris, I mean, it does seem sometimes, it doesn't do us any harm to do a little bit of hoping if it resets our appetite for change. Do you think that maybe if we see other commitments similar to what we've seen in South Africa, it could be leveraged by the rest of the continent, so badly lacking in energy infrastructure, as a way to sort of kickstart some kind of Marshall Plan into broader continental energy systems?
Yeah, no, I agree. And then if I look at, I'll be fortunate enough to be going to COP this week. And from a personal perspective, one of the key outcome I would like to see from COP are tangible plans coming out, both from, you could call it the developed world in terms of capital that's available to be provided, but also from countries in the continent in terms of implementation of the national determined contribution plans, implementations of kind of real policies that will enable more capital to flow into respective countries to help address some of the climate challenges, both from a mitigation perspective, but from an adaptation perspective. So I think for me, I guess my wish from this COP is one where there are some tangible, concrete actions coming out, both from host African countries in terms of committing to a plan, putting the right policies in place, because with the right policies in place, you can attract more capital. And then having similar approach to what was announced yesterday with regards to potentially the quantum of capital that then can be made available for supporting this transition, the kind of resilient infrastructure from an adaptation resilient perspective, because I just think there's just so much to do. So that would be kind of the way I would look at it. So it is a hope, but also, I guess, a follow through from COP26, where some similar announcements were made. So the announcement on the just energy transition for South Africa was actually discussed at COP26.
Yeah.
We're now starting to see some actions out of it. So for this COP, it would be great to see a lot more countries in the continent committing to a directional perspective and policy, as well as financial institutions like ourselves and others, then bring in some of our capital to use to create real impact, both from a climate perspective, but inherently the development impact that you then get from those that capital being utilized in the market.
Linda, Chris and I are both hopeless optimists, so help us. You're very familiar with South Africa, but also the Southern Africa region. And when you look at the potential for the growth of clean energy in South Africa and in Southern Africa, what are the roadblocks? Is it, state-owned companies? Is it the lack of capital, access to finance? What is it that makes you more skeptical about a fast rollout of funding into green energy? I think we may have lost Linda just as she was about to bring us back to earth, Chris, with a bump. Let me continue with you for a moment.
So maybe, should I touch on maybe some of that? Because I think
that would be good.
Whilst you talk about bringing us down with a bump, I think the other reality is, if we look at South Africa, if I look at the continent, so one of the benefits of what we do at BII by covering all of Africa is you get to understand and see the different directions different governments are focused on different policies. So if we look at Africa today, where is the largest program for climate and therefore renewable? It is South Africa. It's not necessarily moved at the pace that the South Africans might have wished for, driven by the current challenges on energy supply there. But if I look at it relative to other parts of the continent, it is actually the largest renewable market that's out there. And we at BII, through one of our key investee companies, Globalec, participated in a number of the projects and kind of bid processes that have been run there to enable the South African government ultimately to put more renewable energy onto the grid. And therefore, that is then allowing for true private capital to be put to use in South Africa. Probably the next country in the continent, I would say, next to South Africa is Egypt. But these two countries are miles ahead of all the other countries in the continent in terms of the scale of energy access or kind of energy electrons that's actually needed, and the opportunity, therefore, for more capital to flow to some of these countries. So as much as we could take South Africa and say, is it really moving at pace? I think there's a policy, there's a program, and it is moving and capital is flowing to the country. My wish is other countries in the continent also may potentially learn from what's going on in South Africa, potentially what's going on in Egypt, to then allow institutions like ourselves and others to be able to come and support with capital and basically helped their path in terms of their approach to net zero.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. Linda, while you were gone, Chris was telling us that actually, there are reasons to be cheerful in terms of the rollout of renewables in South Africa and Southern Africa. Take us from there.
Okay. Well, I dropped off because of load shedding, unfortunately. I think that explains my lack of optimism as things currently stand. But not to be too cynical, I mean, obviously, we are a product of the success of the renewable energy IPP program in South Africa. And up until recently, it had a very successful run. It was voted amongst one of the top 4 investments internationally. Unfortunately, there were stumbling blocks due to some political interference, but we've seen it pick up again, although we have not yet successfully built anything new since round 4 of the REAP program. There's been further extensions to REAP round 5. And I mean, that's caused a delay for much needed capacity in the country. That being said, there's been a lot of positive steps in the right direction from our president and the ministries, respectively. And most for me encouraging is the current process that's happening with Eskom and what's currently happening with the transmission. So you asked before I dropped off what I think the stumbling blocks are. I think we focus a lot on power generation. We also don't focus on the transmission and the grid. So most of the grid infrastructure in Africa isn't built for renewable energy, which is an intermittent energy source. In addition to that, it's the old age regulatory policy issues. So outside of South Africa, we don't really have a wide scale government-backed program in the region, right? So you've got Namibia that has some projects that are going and has made some strides. Zimbabwe, we know with the current economic issues and challenges it's facing. Zambia is also facing issues around grid infrastructure, and the president is also trying to resolve those issues as well. So there's a variety of issues for me which comprise mainly of policy, grid infrastructure, as well as an actual commitment from governments financially to back the off-takers. No investor is going to come and put money where they're not guaranteed a return. So I think that is the major issue that is stifling growth. You look at a country like Nigeria with a lot of potential for renewable energy. So many of us have put in bids in Nigeria, been successful, and the program hasn't picked up because the off-taker is not bankable. Most of the distribution companies, etc., are also not financially sound. So if we're going to be serious about the rollout of renewables, we need to first address the legacy issues domestically. So my big concern is that the money comes in, is it going to be applied appropriately to address the issues that currently exist in each country?
Chris, surely that's a role for BII and development institutions, development finance institutions more broadly, making off-takers bankable, essentially, as Linda says, making it worthwhile for renewable energy companies to target these markets because they're going to get paid.
No, this is core to the ability for some of these markets or countries to attract more capital. Development finance institutions are there to take some level of risk, but ultimately success for us is being able to mobilize more commercial capital into the countries and into the space. And I'll pick South Africa again. It's been delayed, but South Africa has been able to attract development finance capital, but also commercial capital into the program. Because why? There is policy in place, there's a level of predictability to it to an extent, there's a rule of law, and there's a willingness of government. Even with all the issues of ESCOM, there was a willingness for government to listen to what's required to enable more private capital and different forms of capital to come in. So I think, to my point earlier, that's what other parts of the continent needs to take on board to learn, because life is about learning in my mind, and optimizing what, say, South Africa's done, to then use that to replicate a potential model that allows more capital to come. From a BII perspective, very much on the same page as Linda. I think there is a lot of generation capacity in the continent as a whole. What's been lacking is the ability to move the electrons all the way to the end user. This is where transmission lines, this is where distribution systems, that I think is where there's been lack of investment thus far, largely because some of these assets have been held in government. And I think there comes a time where, due to fiscal challenges, governments in some of these markets need to create the enabling environment to allow the private sector to come in and help fund some of the capital costs required. Because we're talking about huge capital cost to upgrade transmission infrastructure, to upgrade distribution infrastructure. In 2018, what we did at BII was, with 60 years of experience investing in the generation space in Africa, what we realized is actually the transmission and distribution space is where a lot of capital is required. So we set up a company called GridWorks. And GridWorks is a developer, investor focused on on-grid, off-grid transmission and distribution. And the idea was for us to basically put some of our capital at risk to work alongside receptive government. And I think Linda used the word about, I think you used the word governments need to be open. I call it receptivity, because if there's a government who's receptive, who understands that this is about a journey, then institutions are willing to take some level of risk, because you can then start to predict where this might land. So that's what we did with GridWorks. I think at the beginning of this year in the summer, GridWorks was fortunate to announce a project in Uganda where GridWorks is looking to put some capital to use to upgrade some of the transmission infrastructure there to help move some stranded power to where it's most needed. Ultimately, what will that do? That would allow industrialization, because when we talk about stranded power, I think the continent can only progress by us being able to put electricity to use for industrialization. That's when you can then start to talk about local manufacturing. That's where you can then talk about local generated revenue, be it some of these industries pay more taxes. Ultimately, these feeding back to the utility and making the utility being able to sustain themselves and ultimately enable more investors to come in. So I think that I guess is the plea, which is the capital is available. There are markets in Africa that have gone through this journey, not many, but some. So coming out of COP, more generally, I think it should be an ambition for some of these governments to tap into some of this capital by focusing on policy, by focusing on creating the enabling environment for the private sector and development finance institution. Because I think once you have those ingredients, then you can then start to see more positive investments, more development impact being created across our markets. And again, I agree with Linda. Nigeria is a classic example. The opportunity there is vast. The industrialization opportunity there is huge. But what is required is probably an investment in the grid, in transmission infrastructure. Until you do that, it will be a struggle for the system to absorb the intermittent renewable energy from wind and solar that I guess we are all talking about in terms of the quick way to get to a positive position from a climate mitigation perspective.
Linda, one of the solutions which is called out regularly is green hydrogen as a way perhaps of getting energy from areas of the world which are rich in renewable potential, like so many parts of the continent, to be honest, and getting them to energy-intensive parts of the world, like Europe, like Asia. And so we had initiatives like the German government linking with Namibia to look into, a large-scale green hydrogen facility. Is that bandwagon which has come to South Africa? Are you getting increasing interest in green hydrogen projects?
Yes, it has. And actually, we're having our first green hydrogen conference later on this year. And I think there's one major project that's under, well, two that are under development that I am aware of. But to my knowledge and understanding, it's not yet at a state where it could effectively be used from a price perspective domestically. So it's not yet at an affordable level. But if we can take a step back as well, for me, before green hydrogen is the gas that's being exported to Europe as well to be utilized, negating the fact that Africa has its own domestic supply demands. I think before we can think of exportation, we need to look at our own domestic needs, whatever the source is, because we are suffering from an energy poverty on the continent. So I think before Africa takes care of anything else, it needs to take care of its domestic need, and we haven't done that. And because predominantly the issue even around gas has been the lack of pricing that is cost reflective and the lack of investment in that gas infrastructure. For me, I see a happy union between renewables and gas in addressing some of these domestic needs for our energy requirements on the continent.
On that subject, Linda, which sort of backs into this idea of a just transition, do you think there is, I wouldn't call it a hypocrisy, I would call it perhaps a lack of understanding or a lack of connection to the realities of the continent? Most people in Africa don't have great energy choices, as you say, and their primary choice isn't between renewable power or gas. It's between, cutting down a tree or perhaps using gas if they're lucky. Do you think African climate negotiators have fully seized the leverage that Africa has? If the Congo River Basin was to disappear, which it will if we continue these rates and if a just transition isn't actually on the cards, then it's game over for the climate. We won't have our second lung. The Amazon, everyone's glad that President Lula was elected, but the Amazon is suffering. If Africa's great forests disappear, it's going to be quite complicated. So when it comes to the issues you raise about, Africa hasn't sorted out its own energy poverty issues yet, and it's currently exporting gas probably from Mozambique straight to Europe, and not much of it will see Mozambique power generation. Do you think that the leverage that Africa has is sort of going left on the table, as it were?
I do, and that's because we have these forums where we discuss amongst ourselves and not with government leadership in the room. And it's the same thing I said last week in an event in Abidjan, the AIF, and I said that the biggest issue I have is that the two energy panels are at the end of the day when the presidents have left. And this is perhaps the most important discussion to have amongst us. We're peers. Chris and I probably hold the similar views on most matters. But insofar as how government negotiates, how government plans, how government thinks, we have a number of advisory panels, that report to our various political leadership. But it's really never reflective of what's going on in the market from people who are actually working in the sector, So there's certain things, I mean, obviously for Mozambique to generate an income, it has to export some of that gas. There's no arguments about that. But I think it's just about what is the strategy around, creating a market domestically or exporting regionally within the continent. This is where things like the Africa Free Trade Agreements come in. It's not that one country is going to utilize that gas, but a country like South Africa and the SADC region may need that gas. So there isn't much coordination, planning, and there isn't much interaction with the people that actually function in this sector. And I think government operates in silos with other policymakers in the absence of practical, logical business advice, if I can say it that way. So Africa has definitely left a lot of leverage on the table. And for me, a simple example of the gas story would be to say, here is the gas we're exporting. There should be a requirement that part of the funds need to go towards building our gas pipeline infrastructure, upgrading our infrastructure. So not only the cash component, but an infrastructure build component, because we sit in a position to be able to call those shots currently with what's happening globally. But I don't know who is advising our governments. Or if they listen.
BII has a certain convening power, whether you like it or not. And I'm sure most of the advice, if you give any, happens behind closed doors. But perhaps as a last word, as we draw this to a close, what are the potential ways that Africa can really start to bring this issue of its own energy needs higher up this discussion?
I think, as Linda was talking through some of the issues, I was just thinking ahead, because I was also in Abidjan, and some of the themes coming out of Abidjan's were very much reactive. So reactive in the sense that, okay, the Ukraine-Russia war suddenly got everyone thinking about food security. It's got everyone suddenly thinking about, we need to start processing some of the food we export or goods we export so that we can retain value in the continent. So this is not new, but this is a kind of a reactive thing. The same on the fuel side. So a lot of the landlocked countries have suddenly realized that actually this is the time we need to harness the potential for renewables to avoid us importing because of the challenges on FX. So for me, I think Linda's point are very pertinent in the sense that one could be the continent isn't acting well enough as one to basically, for example, it took a while before the free trade agreement got signed. It took a while for the continent to really understand the benefit of being able to intertrade. So I think it's around how can we get some of those lessons learned to be more proactive rather than being reactive, because we seem to go in cycle. I've been in the African infrastructure space now for quite a long time, and some of these things are cyclical, and I'm sure Linda has probably seen some of these. So how do we do it? I think continuously highlighting and bringing as many partners together alongside government to say the same thing. Probably the private sector players like ourselves, which we continue to do, working maybe even more collaboratively with other development finance institutions, MDBs, we've got the AFDB, particularly for Africa, Africa 50, maybe using those levers to get closer to decision makers in government, for them to lever on our own knowledge base, skill sets. Companies like Linda's companies also being in the mix. And, I'm a believer in just, starting on a journey and using a country as an example of what's possible. Maybe picking one or two of countries on the continent where you can start to demonstrate, if you have a plan, if the will is there, then you can start to make change happen and play on the lever of the continent. Unfortunately, it takes some of these reactive events globally for people to start thinking about it. And maybe this is the time where we are seeing more floods, we are seeing more droughts. There's no kind of plan to when the Ukraine-Russia issues ending. So therefore, there's going to be continued challenge on FX. We're seeing high inflation environment. Maybe it's a point now where technocrats, development institutions like ourselves, should lever on the influence we have to get government around the table. Most likely governments who are receptive and willing to listen and act, and use that as a lever to bring other parts of the total 54 countries in the continent together. Because I think if you try and solve all of it as one, it will take a while. It might just be something around, let's be selective on the initial countries where we do know there's receptiveness of government, and then using that as setting the example. Because I think the continent is good at seeing what good looks like from other parts of the continent and then mirroring that. So that's probably what I would say is a potential route to try and address some of this. But it is something that we all continue to see, and I'm sure Linda would have seen all the same themes coming out of Abidjan, as you've probably seen in other conferences across the continent.
Linda, I want to give you the last word. If you had a collection of African policymakers at the highest sphere round the table, what would you tell them in under a minute?
Start seeing your country as a corporation. Start looking at the bottom line, working for the bottom line of your people, and start making sure you are deriving a benefit from whatever deal you are making. So if we are getting 8.5 billion from COP27, how is it going to apply? How is it going to be applied, and how are we going to, make a return on that 8.5 billion? So Chris said we're starting, it's at least a start, which is true, fair enough. It's at least a start, it's not enough, but how do we make a profit out of that 8.5 billion for South Africa Inc.? If we started doing that, we start looking at ways to derive value from these transactions for our own economies. Because my cynicism does not come from being negative about climate change or COP27. It comes from, we do not want to be sitting 5-10 years from now with a revolution caused by unemployment. So we need to start thinking about it now.
Fantastic. Well, Chris, Linda, thanks very much for your revolutionary thoughts. This brings this digital event to an end. We hope you have great success, Chris, in your negotiations in COP. Linda, I'm not sure if you're in Sharm or if you're headed to Sharm el-Sheikh. Likewise, thanks both for your great contributions to this debate. If you are interested in more events which try and push things forwards and bring together players from the private sector and the public sector, often who require some of the dressings down that Linda is suggesting, then please find your way to Lomé at the end of November for the Africa Financial Industry Summit, which is the next event to come from Jeune Afrique Media Group. We want to thank BII for the partnership. Thanks for the conversation, and hope to see you this time next year.